Good afternoon. So just for reference, this session is OSS Security Maturity, time to put on your big boy pants. And our speakers today are Jake Coons and Christine Gadsby. So if neither of those resonate with you, you're in the wrong room. The rest of you, success. A couple of notes before we sort of get going. First of all, is just to remind you to stop in the business hall located in Bayside AB. The Black Hat Arsenal is on in Palm Foyer on level 3, and of course the reception is at 5 o'clock this evening. If you haven't picked up your merchandise today, it's your last chance to visit the Black Hat Swag and Bookstore. And as a quick reminder, if you can all put your cell phones on vibrate, it's way more fun that way, but it is less interrupting for everybody around. And so without further ado, Jake and Christine.
Thank you. Appreciate it. How's everyone doing? A little more energy. Doing all right? Yeah. All right. After lunch, I get it. So welcome to our session. We're really thrilled to be here. It is OSS Security Maturity, time to put on your big boy pants. I've taken a little criticism for that title. However, it's her idea. I think it's cool, but
totally my idea.
But we're thrilled to be here today. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Jake Coons. I'm the CISO for risk-based security. We do vulnerability intelligence and vendor risk stuff. And Christine is Director of Product Security for BlackBerry. And when I've been introducing her, I keep calling her Christine Gatsberry, confusing anyways, you know.
That's gonna stick.
It's gonna stick now, instead of Gatsby, Gatsberry.
Yep, it's totally gonna stick.
But so there are a lot of people in various stages on this topic, right? And we wanted to try to put together a talk today that was gonna mean something to everyone. And that can be pretty tough when some people are already researching this and a bit more advanced in OSS security and some that are just getting started. So we want to make this valuable no matter where you are in your journey. So in part one, we're gonna do an introduction to OSS security issues, brief or maybe not that brief. We're gonna review some vulnerabilities. We're then gonna cover some legal concerns and then discuss ways that we can evaluate OSS. Now the second part of the talk, this really is the most important part of the talk, and I really am so thrilled and pleased to be here speaking with Christine today. Really appreciate her efforts. It was a lot of work to get to this point, and I want to thank BlackBerry for opening up and sharing with us today. Not every vendor wants to share, so it's pretty great that they're sharing some information, explaining what they're up to. Hopefully this will encourage some other vendors to also share what they're doing. So it's not just highlighting problems, but how we are seeing people solve some problems. So in part two, we're gonna hear why OSS management is important to BlackBerry. We're gonna learn a little bit about the BlackBerry security maturity model that they're using, some tools, and then a case study, show me the money, what is the cost and what have they been able to do. So what is OSS, right? Funny enough, if you ask a lot of people, you think everyone in this room should know it. Hopefully everyone does, but you ask some people randomly what OSS is, and they get a little bit of a pause, and they might actually not know what you're talking about. So I figured, why don't I go out and ask Google what OSS is? And there's always some really funny stuff when you ask Google about things, right? So searching for OSS on Google, OSS might not be exactly what you think it is. And my favorite is this open source sausages, right? So if anyone asks you for the rest of Black Hat or DEF CON what OSS is, you just say open source sausages, and that's it, right? This is a sausage shop up in Madison, Wisconsin. You can also see they're not big fans of Ohio State either, so anyways. But of course, what are we talking about? We're talking about open source software, right? And so open source has been around for a long time, we all know that. But we wanted to take some time to share with everyone some results from a recent study. What is the feeling and perception of open source these days? There was a study called, it's a 2016, The Future of Open Source, sponsored by Black Duck Software. It's actually in their 10th year. They had over 1,300 responses, so it's helpful to understand, again, that perspective and viewpoints of open source. The link's up there. You can go search for it. You can read it in detail and understand a bit more about the context and the data and all that sort of stuff if you want to do that. But some key things, 90% of the respondents, they said that open source improves efficiency. You figured that one, right? You figured they would say things around, it's free and it's cheap and that sort of stuff. But 90% also said that interoperability and innovation is what they're looking for open source to improve, and they felt like that it did. When you think about participation in open source projects, there were some interesting stats in here as well. 67% of the respondents actively encouraged developers at their company to engage and contribute in open source projects. The same amount, just a little bit less, 65%, said that they were actively contributing to open source projects. 59% said that they do that because they think it gives them some point of competitive advantage by participating. And then one in three companies had a full-time resource dedicated to open source projects. Now, how many people in the room have done some sort of open source projects or are involved with one? All right, well, quite a few of you. So my experience didn't seem that there were a lot of people contributing to the open source project. We always seem to be struggling with it. So some of these numbers of people getting more and more involved, I think it's great if it's really happening. I don't necessarily know I entirely believe it, but the fact that the respondents are starting to say that they think it makes sense, hopefully we'll see more contributions. So in terms of reviewing open source code, the top ways that they responded, they said that 48% development teams were manually keeping track of open source usage. 30% asked their developers, hey, what open source content are you using? And then 21% of the respondents said that there was some sort of third-party tool that was scanning, trying to help and determine the open source. And then when you look at the security and management parts, some of the results were concerning, but let's be honest, not too surprising, right? 50% of the companies said they have no formal policy for selecting and approving the open source code that they're using. 47% of the companies don't have a formal process in place to actually track the open source, so they don't really know where this stuff is. And then more than 1/3 companies have absolutely no process for identifying, tracking, or fixing any open source vulnerabilities. So not shocking, but concerning, right? So does anyone remember Gator by chance? Remember Gator? Not too many. There's a movie called The Other Guys you should go check out. But Gator wants to know if you've got your big boy pants and your snack. And what Gator really wants to know is, do you know what you're doing with your open source software? Do you know where your OSS is? And is it actively being managed for security issues? So we wanted to know how much software is out there and how much are companies having to deal with, right, in a normal organization. So we reached out to a company called Device42. They're a data center infrastructure management company, and they were willing to share some data and a chart with us. And so it's a bit of an eye chart, but effectively the key points that came from it was that larger companies by revenue pretty obviously have exponential more servers, more software, and therefore they have a larger attack surface, right? But one of the points that was sort of eye-opening to me is that each server on average is hosting about 120 pieces of software, counting versions as distinct. So while this isn't just open source software that they're sharing, it shows us that there's a ton more software on each server than maybe you would expect, and that the attack surface obviously increases with server count. So yes, it's absolutely critical that you know where your assets are, right? Just because it's too hard, it's not acceptable. You need to figure out where your assets are if you're going to properly secure them, right? So we know we've got all this software, right? We've got a ton of software that we need to secure, and we're looking at vulnerabilities, and if you look back over the last 10 years of vulnerabilities being released, things aren't getting better, right? In 2014, there were over 14,000 vulnerabilities released. 2015, there were another 14,000 vulnerabilities released. 2016 is already on a bad chart here, right? We're not seeing more secure software being produced, whether it's open source or not. So it's clear that we need to see better, more secure software, but it's just not happening. So when you think about open source software, most people will sit there and say, hey, this is some sort of free software, or some sort of open license, right? And it's more than just Linux, right? You hear open source, you think, oh, Linux. Well, yes, but it's more than that. And it's not just big data open source databases, right? Or some sort of application. There's more to it what we need to be aware of. And what we want to share a little bit about is this thing called third-party libraries, right? So third-party library usage is already pretty substantial, and it's growing more and more organizations are using it. And if you're sitting in the room right now and you're looking at this going, third-party libraries, we don't have any of that stuff. We don't care. We don't need to care about that stuff. Think again, right? This stuff is in your organization already. So what's going on with this third-party libraries? Well, effectively, developers are using established third-party libraries or other code bases, right? Other people's code, more than you know, and for quite a few reasons. And it makes sense, right? They want to speed up the development process. You want to accelerate the time to market, realize quality improvements. I mean, what do you and your internal team know about some font rendering or image, stuff, right? Why don't you use something that's been out there for quite some time? So you can actually get quality improvements over you doing it yourself. And in some ways, if you think back to that survey we talked about, the importance of interoperability and what open source provides, you can get this from using libraries, right? So the whole concept of better, faster, cheaper, and your company saying, yeah, don't pick two, we need all three, third-party code and libraries can accelerate that process and help you get there. But many companies are unclear on the sustainment cost to developers as well as their customers. They have no idea the risks, et cetera. Now, this just isn't Heartbleed. And while OpenSSL really opened the eyes to open source libraries, we promise we're not just going to rehash the same old OpenSSL issues that have been done over and over. But it definitely highlighted the third-party and open source libraries that they have that single vulnerability can spread to multiple products, right? So it exposes enterprises and requires software vendors and IT organizations to that same vulnerability repeatedly. And with the huge amount of third-party libraries being used, as well as the vulnerabilities continuing to come out, this is something that every organization needs to be able to address and in a repeatable fashion, because it's happening over and over. So last year, since we don't want to talk about OpenSSL, last year, Joshua Drake, JDuck, presented here at Black Hat, and his talk was called Stage Fright, Scary Code in the Heart of Android. You can find his talk on YouTube, so if you want to go learn more about it or you've seen it, awesome, go check it out. But his talk also, again, highlighted third-party libraries and the systemic risk of, again, that one vulnerability all over the place really nicely. Stage Fright is basically the multimedia framework for Android, right? It handles all the video and audio and playbacks and all those sorts of things. And 6 critical vulnerabilities were found in these Android phones, leaving them all basically open to attack by a simple multimedia text message, right? Remote code execution. But Stage Fright's not just in Android, right? It's found in Firefox, Firefox OS, Mac OS X, Windows, and even we're seeing it popping up in all these other embedded devices. So if someone said, do you use Stage Fright? You go, no, we're just a Windows shop. Well, guess what? Stage Fright's in there, right? So you have these libraries. So his talk, again, was this time last year, right? And in March of 2016, it was found that 850 million Android devices were still open to this issue, right? Even though he got a lot of press on this, he spoke here and all that sort of stuff, we didn't go about fixing them, right? And if you look at the timeline of Stage Fright vulnerabilities that are coming out, you can see that we're not even fixing the well-known critical stuff in these libraries, and more vulns are coming out over and over. So it's definitely a problem. Now, as many of you know, Tavis Ormandy has been reviewing antivirus products recently, which again just shows that security companies and security products suck at coding too, right? Even a security vendor has problems and don't have secure products, which is just a sad and a shame. But Symantec was the most recent antivirus vendor product to fall, and quite badly. So in reports that he published, he actually said, these vulnerabilities are as bad as it gets. Right? So not very good. Now, one of the vulnerabilities here, CVE 2016-2207, you can see the write-up. Hopefully this helps you, right? But when you actually look at it, what you see is the description discusses Symantec Norton, right? And if you look at what products are impacted, it's just Symantec and Norton products. And while, yes, it's true they were affected, this is a third-party library vulnerability, right? This is in UNRAR. So anyone that's using UNRAR probably has no idea that this was a vulnerability, because this came out just being talked about as a Symantec antivirus problem. But the vulnerability itself is actually in a library used by Symantec antivirus. Here we go again, right? CVE 2016-2211. Another issue that Tavis found in semantic products. And here you get your write-up. Hopefully that helps you figure out what's going on. And what you can figure out is it's, again, the description is just semantic, right? Products affected, just semantic. And what do you think, right? You guessed it, it's another third-party library that's impacted, right? So it just goes to show you that there are so many third-party library in places that you just wouldn't expect. So now Tavis also goes on and in a report that they put out, he points out rightly that everyone has to do vulnerability management, right? And it's just not scanning your network. Even software developers need to do vulnerability management. Monitor for new releases, look out for published vulnerability announcements. And it was really clear that Symantec was not managing their third-party libraries properly. He was able to see that they were using code from several open source libraries. They hadn't updated them, dozens of well-known vulnerabilities in the libraries. And again, security companies that should know this just aren't doing this. They're not mature in handling this stuff properly. And it's so bad that it's been found that they hadn't updated these libraries in at least 7 years. Right? So it's not like something just came out and then they said, oh, whoops, we didn't get to it fast enough. Not updating these libraries at all for quite some time. So if Symantec could sort of just put on their big boy pants, that would be great. And other security vendors too. We would love to see what's going on in the security community, us sort of practicing what we preach, right? But if you reflect on your own company and what you're actually doing, what are you doing in this third-party library space? All right, so we want to take a little time now to talk about the government oversight and the FTC. You may or may not know about some of this stuff, but in 2014, it became clear that the FTC was expanding their cybersecurity review and influence. In early 2014, there was a settlement with a company called TrendNet. TrendNet ended up selling and were marketing what they called their secure view cameras for monitoring, which had a big focus on baby monitoring, right? And it was found that they were ridiculously insecure, and it allowed people to view unsuspecting families in a nursery and exposing what you wouldn't want to be exposed, right? So the FTC complaint was that TrendNet had lax security practices, right? So when the FTC is looking at things, they're always looking for consumer protection. So if you're marketing that your product is secure, right? Secure view, trust us with secure baby monitoring, and they come to find out that you have problems, and furthermore, that you're not even doing this tall to ride the ride stuff, it's a problem, right? So not only are they're looking at not only just that sort of stuff, they're looking at all areas of cyber, that anything that could impact consumers, right? So in end of 2014, it was clear that they were concerned over weak consumer provisions in the automotive world, that they were seeing all these sort of additional high-tech features incorporated into automobiles, and they were concerned about the security aspects of it. So again, just another example that shows they're looking at all industries. Another more recent example, very similar to the TrendNet stuff, was ASUS. They settled due to insecure home routers, putting consumers, again, at risk, exposing storage devices and internet on the information, right? Or on the internet. So information was out on the internet without people knowing. This was February of this year. The FTC has also been pretty clear that they're watching other IoT consumer devices as well. Now, something a little different is that there's some other cases where the FTC can go after people, and there's one called that they're going after with LabMD. And there was a weird thing where they overturned a rule, a judge's ruling just last month. So the FTC's basically alleged that LabMD had weak protections and they didn't secure patient information properly. So the FTC move is going to be really interesting. It looks like it's going to be some more federal court battles of can the FTC do this or not. But again, if you're putting out products to consumers wrong or you're not protecting information, the FTC is watching. And finally, last month, the FTC announced increased fines. So the FTC has increased their maximum fine from $16,000 to $40,000 for certain violations of Section 5 of the FTC Act. And Section 5 of the FTC Act, it prohibits unfair and deceptive acts or practices. So I like to think of it this way. If you were to see a company marketing some weight loss diet pill and it said, just take this pill, everything's going to be awesome, take it once a day, you're going to lose all this weight, oh, you're going to be smart, everything's going to be amazing, and it's just a scam, that's a huge problem, right? And the FTC is going to go after them for that. And if companies continue to market the unbreakable stuff, right, totally secure, those sorts of things, and they're not even demonstrating that they're investing in security or care about it, this is where you're seeing the FTC expand to, right? So fines aren't the only thing that the FTC uses for the OSS and the TrendNet. They were requiring them now to have audits every other year for 20 years, that they have to notify their customers properly. They're no longer allowed to market inappropriately. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and they really want to ensure that products are secure, protecting their consumers. So for any of you that have kids and you've seen this Lego movie over and over, you know, honey, where are my pants? Which goes on in my house a lot. We're basically saying, what about if you're using someone else's pants, right? Using someone else's code, a third-party library in your product. How's this going to come out in that liability space? Well, there's a lot of precedent already with what we call product liability out there, right? And so a lot of this stuff has already been talked about and decided in that more product tangible space. But we're now starting to see people starting to talk about software liability, right? Specifically where software controls more physical products, devices, cars, IoT, all those sorts of things. And so at the end of the day, when you think about it, it's not the software that hurts people. It's a component of this larger finished product, making it a product failure, not just the software as a portion of it. So there's one big case back from 1916 that really set this whole product liability stuff into place that I want to share with you pretty quickly. But it's McPherson versus Buick Motor Company. It's effectively what happened. Donald McPherson was injured when one of the wooden wheels of his 1909 Buick Runabout collapsed, okay? But Buick Motor Company, basically, they manufactured the vehicle, but what they said was they didn't manufacture the wheel that collapsed. Someone else did, right? And what came out was, it doesn't matter. You're the one that put everything together. Just because you didn't manufacture the wheel, you put it all together, you sold the car, therefore you are liable for it. It's the final product. So if you think about it, software responsibility is basically just going to be just that too, right? If you're embedding software in products, the final product is where it's going to be. So if you use third-party code in your product, you're responsible for the security of that as well, right? Going back to the semantic example, it doesn't matter if it was in their native code or third-party library. The semantic antivirus got popped, right? So we need to make sure we understand that also from a liability standpoint. There's a lot more about this software liability stuff that you can research, both the good and the bad of it. If you're interested in the topic, there's tons out there to search for it. Lots of different viewpoints. Some people think it's awful. Some people think it's great. I think more people think it's the devil than thinking it's great, but there's a lot of debate going on it. And there's even a webcast out there from myself and Josh Corman if you want to get some primers on some of those things as well. All right, so there's a clear need to manage open source software, right, and third-party code. Most people, when you say vulnerability management, they know sort of that whack-a-mole game, right, for normal software products. You know, the vulns come out, we got to fix them, right? Vulns come out, we got to fix them. Just, it isn't clear that that's still an issue when it comes to third-party libraries, right? It's sort of that traditional products that people think about it. So it's important, right? I mean, you need to fix security vulnerabilities, but you need to know that you're not just having to ensure that they're fixed in your own code. It's got to be anything that you're using that's a component of. So you have to start thinking, how are you going to be notified about these new issues? What's the cadence or the release cycle from some third-party library or other person's code that you're using, right? Too few, then it leaves you open to risk and liability because things aren't getting fixed enough and released enough. Too many, I mean, that's a huge cost of ownership, and maybe you're not going to be able to pull this library stuff into your code or your products quick enough. Maybe it's just not possible, right? So there's this need for the porridge being just right, and obviously we'd prefer that secure coding principles are in place and the software that we're using is secure up front, right? This patching problem, that's a symptom. The root cause is insecure code, right? So we know that we have to fix all this stuff, but we don't want to have overlooked is the fact that we actually need to evaluate open source software. We need to evaluate these third-party libraries. Now, again, there's a ton of it at your organization already, and it's there and you have to deal with it. But if you have the potential to evaluate it prior to selection is what we would hope to happen, right? You need to determine if you think this project is mature enough to rely on. Is it end of life? Are you still seeing regular updates? Are there known vulnerabilities that haven't been fixed? Can you determine a true cost of ownership? The initial usage of anything open source or a third-party library, it's free and it's amazing, but there's some hidden costs to maintain that maybe aren't factored in. So how do we actually evaluate open source software? There's actually lots of ways, actually. So evaluate the viability of a project. Is there sponsorship? What's the project look like? Is there risk of it being abandoned? What's the health of the project, right? Number of contributors, number of updates, size of code, things like that. Are there support options for you in case you need them? Do they publish security advisories? Is there a contact person or a bug bounty or any sorts of things like that for security reporting that can help? And then actually vulnerability statistics and timeline stuff, metrics can help, right? How long does it take them to work with a researcher? Do they respond to researchers? How long is it taking them to put out a patch, right? If a vulnerability comes out and they don't patch it for a year, that's a problem, right? So all of these things can help you to get some better perspective. So what? The more the question is, now what? And there's a lot more to know about this stuff. So it can be a pretty complicated situation, and we're not going to go into all that now. So I just want to highlight a couple other talks that you can look at. If you want to learn more, there was a 2014 talk here at Black Hat with Kimberly Price. This was really talking and drilling into sort of that attack surface spread. So that's a good place to start as a primer if you're looking for more information. The following year here, again at Black Hat, another talk with Kimberly Price, much longer, diving into those vulnerability timeline metrics, vendor risk ratings, reviewing products and libraries, all those sorts of things, as well as additional information on incident response and handling those sorts of issues. So while there's some that are still learning and haven't even started this, and I'm glad those of you who are in the room are going to start getting cracking on this, there are other folks that are actually trying to implement this stuff and get better at managing their open source software. So in the past 2 years after talks at Black Hat, both Kimberly and I have had tons of people saying, we want more information about the operations standpoint. It's great to get up here and tell us there's problems, but how are we going to get these things fixed? What are people doing to solve this? More case study information. And so with this, someone is wearing her big girl pants. And I'm really, really happy that Christine is here, that she's going to be able to share some information about what her and her team are doing and what BlackBerry is doing. I think it's great to see this. It can help build. And if the other people are working on this stuff that can share, then I think it helps our community. So with that, let's talk a little bit about OSS security management at BlackBerry.
I think that's the first and the last time I'll probably be introduced by wearing pants or not wearing pants, which I don't ever speak not wearing pants. That's probably a good thing. Okay, before we get started, just a quick poll. How many in the room are on the engineering side of open source? How many creating products, making fixes, things like that? Okay, how many are on the operations side of the house? So just purely operations like I am. Wow, okay, so very few of you. Okay, one more question and then we'll get going. How many of you feel like the relationship between who's doing your operations and the engineering teams is somewhat strained when it comes to patching open source? Okay, good. That's what I thought. We're not the only ones. Perfect. Great. So now that we got that out of the way, I want to take a step back before we get started and change the way we're thinking about managing open source. When I thought about putting this talk together in this presentation, one of the things I did was think more around engineering, kind of like doctors. So you're taking broken bits of things, putting them together, and healing and making a great product, right? So engineering in the room, think of yourself like the Dr. House, okay, of security. That's your job during the rest of this talk, just for today. You can go back to being engineers when we're done. Operations people, for the few of you that are in the room, like me, we get a bad rap because we like to tell a lot of people what to do. We like to tell them the world's on fire and that they shouldn't be working whatever they're working on. They should be fixing this now because it is 25 times more important than whatever they're doing, and they're doing it wrong. And if you don't do it now, you're going to get in big trouble. So the way I like to think kind of operationally is we're sort of like lawyers. So when you think of it like doctors and lawyers, they sometimes don't get along, right? I mean, there's just no secret there. So hopefully today, when we cover some of these things, it'll make it a little bit more apparent how we can kind of work together. All right, so to get started, I want to give you a little bit of a rundown on BlackBerry. Over the last 18 months, we've acquired all of these amazing security companies you see here on the screen. We've adopted Android to our platform and largely turned into a security software and services business. With our latest acquisition of a company called Encryption, we're actually now even a cybersecurity consultants. And yes, this is amazing. It has been a fantastic ride to be part of a company that has transitioned into what it does best, which is security, but it's also a ton of change. But what does this picture of all of these acquisitions really mean to our cert? So BlackBerry has an amazing incident response team. BlackBerry chose a long time ago to invest in this incident response team. But what does this really mean to the cert? What does all this new stuff mean to us? They're the ones responsible for monitoring and watching all that additional open source. So yes, that's right. This is actually a real picture from our last pCert meeting where Jake and I got together. We talked about all these new acquisitions, and we realized it actually meant an 84% increase in open source usage across the company. So that's huge. That's actually a lot. And you can see I've lost a lot of my hair in the picture, and you actually look great in a green suit, by the way. So here are some fun stats and actually what that means to our pCert. It's now responsible for defending with that 84% increase. 536 unique libraries tracked across 75 product variants. One single product could have 195 unique open source libraries. A product could contain 47 copies of the same library. Did you even know products could contain 47 copies of the same? I didn't think so either.
You say fun, I say scary.
Yeah, these are really actually scary. To the cert, they're all fun, because this is all fun work for us, but to everybody else, it's pretty scary. Up to 16 different versions of a unique library in a single product. That actually gives me a headache even thinking about it. So now that we have our arms wrapped around this and we figured out it was an 84% spread of increase, what are we going to do about it? How much is that actually going to cost us? Because it all happened really quickly. You know, this is 18 months worth of work. So we know there are potential regulatory liabilities, as Jake said, he just covered in his part of the talk, but not factoring in those costs. What are the actual costs for open source security maintenance? Our good friends from Synopsys have some great data points here I wanted to share. In the top picture, software is never in a secure forever state. It actually decays over time. So regardless if you patched it yesterday, code and feature changes and newly discovered vulnerabilities actually cause that decay to erode. In the bottom picture, a commissioned study conducted by Forrester Consulting on behalf of Synopsys in July of 2012 shows us the relative cost of remediating security vulnerabilities is actually 10 to 15 times the cost of code development. 10 to 15 times. Now, that's from 2012, and I get that, but it's hard to believe that it's gotten any cheaper since 2012. So the question then became to us, how do we take our highly functional pCert that we already had, doing a great job, and spread it over 84 times the amount of work in all those various new products we saw 2-3 screens ago? Since we wanted it to be consistently implemented across all these new acquisitions who were in their own various states of security when we purchased them, the BlackBerry open source model was created. Now, the picture you see on the screen here actually is just a summary of what is in each level. The actual model we have is much more complicated, but the font is really too small to see. So we changed it up a little bit just for this talk. But important to note here, prior to making this model, we did research and review a couple other existing models. The capability maturity model itself, and the cybersecurity capability maturity model. But none of these were really the droids we were looking for. We really found that it dealt a lot with managing open source, but not necessarily vulnerabilities. It was a lot about functionality. So this model is really simple but effective. It works from the bottom up. And on the left, you'll find there's a risk meter. And on the right, you'll find the associated cost between the levels. Obviously, as you move up the model, your risk goes down, but the initial need for investment goes up. A couple of thoughts here as we go through it, because we're going to go through the bottom level to the top level. We'll start at 1. We'll start at 1 and we'll go up to level 5. You may find yourself identifying with all parts of the level, and that's totally okay. And you may find that you've mastered a few places in the level, and that's absolutely okay. And you may find that you have mastered all the levels and you are knocking it out at level 5, and that's great. And if you're that person, I would love to talk to you. Here at BlackBerry, we're definitely not saying we are the best. We, at managing open source, we simply want to open the dialogue. It's an ecosystem problem. And if we're not going to talk about how to solve it, none of us are going to gain from each other's knowledge. So we're here just to start the conversation. This is really about, to me, giving enterprise a place to start in their SDLC and a path forward, because managing open source is hard. Just getting along with doctors and lawyers is hard, right? So actually getting those fixes out to customers is triple hard. The entire principle here is that once you've mastered things in one level and you aren't doing something above it, let's get that started. Pretty simple. This was built around control the madness, automate your process, and use your intelligence to make smarter and more secure products. The goals for this model are simple. Improve the understanding, monitoring, and categorization of open source usage across the company. Improve the understanding of your attack surface, risk, and maintenance open source libraries require over their lifetime. Create the ability to associate and, most importantly, reduce the cost of free software, because we all know while it's necessary, it's definitely not free. Lastly, to create the groundwork for an open source strategy. Doctors, you should definitely have an open source plan to develop a product. At a minimum, you should know what the function versus the risk balance is when you're using it. So let's look at level 1. Level 1 is security's worst nightmare. Your ops people, this is what drives them crazy. Whether or not you have a distributed operations team, or you have a central PCERT like we do, or you just have a bunch of people who think they own security and tell engineering what to do, doctors in this case, lawyers running around telling you what to do. This is security's worst nightmare because developers generally have no understanding of open source maintenance requirements, don't understand the cost, definitely don't understand the risk, and they really don't understand the attack surface. You know you're on level 1 if there is lots of crazy town when a public critical vulnerability pops in any open source library. Generally, it's just chaos. Doctors, lawyers don't work together in any sense of the state. They don't like each other. Doctors think lawyers are crazy and paranoid, and lawyers think doctors have no clue about security and they really just don't care. At this level, it's possible, and maybe even common, won't say it happens at our company, but I've heard through the grapevine it might happen other places, that a developer who is responsible for updating a library might not even know what the library is used for or how it got there. Here, there's a general redundancy of open source libraries used in all products because in the land of Jimmy Buffett, as you see, obviously you have a license to chill, so you're just not worried about it. And your vulnerability notification is mostly your CEO calling, asking if you're impacted when something hits the press, and you might not return his call and you may hide because you just may not know. On the bright side, this level is the most cost efficient because there are no resources at all being dedicated to the problem. So the most important thing with level 1 is we have all been there regardless of where you are now. Level 2, this is really where incident response is born. Now, incident response is interesting. I find that a lot of companies have incident response as a distributed model where they have pieces of it in places of the company. It might sit in engineering and some might sit in operations or product management or something like that, and that's fine. The point is that you understand you need to have an incident response function. Some key steps to level 2 in your maturity journey. Creating a software bill of materials. Licensing compliance or product understanding means you need to create a software bill of materials for your products so you know what's actually in them. For some, this bill of materials will shock you. You will look at this and realize you had no idea what's in your products. Back to that slide I had with all the numbers around our libraries. This may be the first time you find out you have 36 copies of something in one of your products. And I highly suspect that after this talk, someone will probably write me and say, I found out I had 60-some versions of something, and that's okay. The key is that you know, right? This is likely the first time you're gonna see how bad your open source spread actually is. In level 2, you're investigating and understanding more public open source vulnerabilities, not just the ones your CEO calls about. You're not only investigating vulns, you're tracking them to make sure they get fixed. Spreadsheets, OneNote, email folders, you've got to start somewhere and it doesn't matter where. You have a plan in place between ops and development for incident response based on the impact of vulnerabilities. If you have a critical vulnerability, there's a plan. Doctors and lawyers work together to get it solved because the whole idea is you protect your customers. A plan that's something other than calling the CEO in the middle of the night because we know he or she loves it when you do that, especially if you haven't investigated it and you're wrong. That's the favorite. So this picture on the bottom here, on the bottom left, is actually why we need level 2. This is an actual JIRA filed by my team a few years back, and Dev's response of what is Bouncy Castle and what is it used for? Yep. All right, so level 2, got it. Moving on to level 3, and this is where it gets a little bit investment-wise. So now that Dev and Ops, doctors and lawyers, we're friends and we're working together a little bit, we understand we We've got to get fixes out to protect our customer. It's time to kind of commit to a relationship. This is where it kind of has to stick forever. We've got to get used to each other, buy each other coffee, maybe have some Slurpees. We just have to stop fighting all the time. That's the key here, is to understand that you have to work together. But again, this is where we also realize there's cost. So here in the first thing of level 3, you're proactively using open source vulnerability intelligence sources. This is so important. You're using real data sources to proactively find vulnerabilities in your products. There are several sources of free and paid vulnerability, or threat intelligence. My amazing friend Jake here has VulnDB. Kim, actually out here in the crowd, she's at Bug Crowd, and they do an amazing bug bounty program. Or simple things like Google keyword alerts, cvedetails.com, RSS feeds, Twitter feeds. There's no shortage of proactive vulnerability intelligence. You're building a process for the open source vulnerability lifecycle with investigation. Back on level 2, you started to track high priority things. Now with your newfound proactive intelligence, you're adding the ability to actually investigate and remediate all known CVEs. You build programs and processes around the investigation, which means now you can move to understanding their actual impact on your product so that you can prioritize the fixes, not just the CVSS score they were given. Fix versus feature. Now, this is a pretty big sticking point for a lot of companies, and I think where doctors and lawyers start to fight. A good friend, Mike Amati, if you know him from Synopsys, he coined a phrase that I'm going to steal real quick because it's actually hilarious, but he coined the ice cream. So features are like ice cream. Everybody loves ice cream, right? Everybody wants a new feature in a product. Like, hey, we're going to get to sort our calendar. That's awesome. Ice cream, chocolate, yay. Fixes are sort of like wheatgrass smoothies. So in order to get a fix out, sometimes you have to say, okay, I got to have a wheatgrass smoothie instead of some ice cream. All right. So in this state of the level, it is really important that development not only has dedicated open source resources, you know who they are, you know where they sit, they fix open source vulnerabilities, and those fixes get prioritized appropriately with features. That's, again, a huge one, and it's tough. And you need a fix vehicle, right? As you start identifying and fixing more vulnerabilities, the fixes will begin to pile up. What are you going to do with them? You need some kind of maintenance release cycle to point those security fixes to in order to get them all out the door to customers, unless you plan daily updates, which is totally fine too. In level 3, you're notifying customers of important security fixes in your products. Those critical vulnerability fixes should go out with customer notification. Customers need to actually know to upgrade in order to be protected. The bottom line, you can spend all the time in the world patching, but if your customers don't know to upgrade and actually take the fix, they're not protected. You have created a place where researchers can disclose vulnerabilities to you. It can be a secure ad inbox, a web form. The important thing is researchers know where the front door is to disclose vulnerabilities to you and not on Twitter. To go along with that, you have a publicly posted vulnerability disclosure policy. So not only do they know where the front door is, they know what to disclose, and they know what to expect from you in response. All right, now that you have your operational house in order, we're going to move into level 4, and this is really where we're going to start getting into tooling and a little bit of investment here. So now that you have all that rich threat intelligence about your products, you need to automate those tools. Amazing intelligence you're gathering, you got to use it all, right? So first, that product catalog you created with that bill of materials is now automated and tracked. You're purchasing or building a tool that will track your open source use and spread in all of your products. Next, because the effort required to track and remediate all those new vulnerabilities you're finding is monumental, level 4 means you're using tooling and automation to drive efficient vulnerability handling. You can use tools to track impacted products, the state of fixes. You're able to create reports by affected and not affected product versions. You can automate Jira or whatever tool you're using for bug filing, and even track those fixes to customers. This way, when the CEO calls about a specific CVE, you actually have an answer and it's accurate. Very important. Lastly, open source vulnerability debt is being used to actually make decisions at the executive level, and it's starting to influence product decisions. You have all this new open source risk knowledge, now it's time to use it to make smarter products. And before we go on to level 5, we're actually going to take a look at how BlackBerry does this with tooling. And I know this is a bit of an eye chart and it's hard to see, so download the deck. It'll be available afterwards. This system was designed to address development and in-market open source needs. There's a tight integration of third-party tooling with custom BlackBerry tooling by design. We partner heavily with folks like Jake and also with Synopsys for Protect Code SC. And I'll kind of go over this really quickly. On the right-hand side of the screen under third-party tooling integration, again, Synopsys Protect Code SC, which was formerly Codenomicon AppCheck, if you didn't know. It's a binary static analysis tool that detects open source and outputs our bill of materials. We have risk-based security from Jake here, VulnDB, which is our intelligence engine that drives investigation, and also plugs into VulnWatcher, which I'll cover on the other side. It's one of our tools. And obviously Jira, our defect tracking tool. All right, on the left side, these are BlackBerry custom tools. These are things we've actually built ourselves. Vader, which creates a digest of a Protect Code scan and known vulnerabilities, and then automatically files Jira's for us. I know it's lovely. It's a lovely, lovely thing. Vulnerabilities are then logged into the product catalog. We can even use this pre-release and integrate that vulnerability data into our case management tools so we don't have duplication of effort. Our product catalog, which is something we've talked about, contains the bill of material for all 75 product variants you saw from that first screen where we were talking about our products, and has every instance of open source captured and cataloged, which is, of course, the key to the whole system. CMT, our case management tool, also our single source of truth. It tracks vulnerability investigations, impacted products, fixes. It automates defect filing for us for in-market like Vader does. And this is also our direct funnel for SecureAt for manual case open. We have VulnWatcher from earlier. It's our engine used to triage new CVEs daily from Vuln database data. That feeds into our other tools. As you can see, this is a pretty monumental investment. These tools took a long time to build, and BlackBerry invested quite heavily in them. All right, super really quick how these tools kind of work together. So a case like Freak comes in back in March of 15. bbcert triage caches it on one side. It feeds into SecureAt. CMT opens a case. We immediately know we have 41 instances of OpenSSL across 26 products, all before the media coverage starts. We file defects. Fixes are tracked and pushed into products, and then we notify customers. Tools are tracking and making the majority of this happen along the way. However, this is really important to note. Even with all of this automation and that heavy tool investing, Freak still costs us $214,000. That's a lot of money. So level 5, are you actually using your vulnerability data to drive better security engineering? It's one thing to disable features because OpenSSL is high risk. It's another thing to have a deep understanding of your product's attack surface and risk reduction opportunities. And it's even another to be able to use that intelligence back into your SDLC. If you know your product landscape has 37 different copies of OpenSSL, then you also know your risk of not patching it is higher. Make educated decisions and design decisions is pretty much the theme of how you get to level 5. Number 1, put it in a box. Minimize that attack surface by using design principles and least privilege. Use your rich data to understand where your high-risk libraries are. Run them in a sandbox or generally lower privilege. Containerize that risk where it needs to be contained. At level 5, you should have a curated open source catalog. This way you not only know of, but you've rationalized your 27 versions of OpenSSL. It's brilliant. And now you have them categorized, organized, and understood. You're removing multiple redundant versions and removing libraries you no longer need. Because some products have libraries built in you just don't use. They're just there, bloating your attack surface. Next, developers are making well-informed open source decisions. If you don't need to use the entire library, don't pick the entire library. Look at turning things off in OpenSSL to reduce features. The bottom line here is, don't take what you don't need to. Make smarter library choices based on vulnerability history and data you're aggregating from level 4. Obviously, if you know the open source you're using is being maintained and updated regularly, that's great. But if it isn't, you need a sustained engineering plan in case it breaks, because it will. Proactive patching. Proactively take new versions of software, irrespective of those known security vulnerabilities, because there are always silent fixes, and we know this. Open source blacklisting. If you know there's an open source library that costs $1 bajillion to maintain, blacklist it. Just don't use it. There are several font rendering engines. Don't just take your favorite, right? All right, sometimes I find this as simple as just having a conversation with dev and just telling them, this one's bad, don't take it. Find something else. Okay, so where does all this hard work get us? What is the return for investment for open source maturity? Why should I do any of this stuff at all? Do I even know where my big boy pants are at this point? This is the good question. Let's talk a little bit about this. This is what BlackBerry spent last year securely maintaining libpng, OpenSSL, and curl. Now that actually, those numbers might sound like a lot, but that's actually 59% less than it cost us 2 years ago. And that's definitely a reflective of a lot of level 4 and level 5 maturing on our part. So it's amazing how much faster you are when you've curated an open source catalog and you simply know where all your stuff is. You can make efficient, educated decisions. And that's actually also, so while our case numbers were up and our resolution time went down, so that's just level 4 and level 5 efficiency there. A commission study conducted by Forrester Consulting on behalf of Synopsys in July of 2016 shows us, so this is just last month this was released, there's a massive return on investment just in third-party tools. So yes, it costs to invest in them, but they save you a ton of money. Here's some other areas that we found savings in, and these are all inclusive of tooling investment costs and that 87% increase in OSS. So if you were at level 1, that $214,000 that cost us, add $87,000 to that if you're at level 1, because that's what it costs you to do a large media event. Our CERT was able to file 401% more defects against OSS being at that mature state. The cost of supporting OSS decreased by 62% per product. Intelligence to defect rate, we are 87% more efficient in just weeding out noise. Our investigation time is 46% faster, and fixes are getting to customers. The most important thing out of this whole thing, 12 times faster being at a mature open source security level than not. So that's it for us. I'd like to thank everybody that contributed to this talk. Ken Matthews, Tyler Towns, Jonathan Brookfield, Brian Martin, Karsten, Kimberly Price, definitely from Bug Crowd, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you again to Christine for sharing all that. We'll be around if you have questions, so come please see us. Thanks, and have a great Black Hat.